Hello, everyone. Welcome to another quarter and another Sunday school teacher workshop. Apologies for not being able to be with you in person, but as you probably are used to my routine by now, which is completely unpredictable. um, I'm in Slidell again, so teaching you from my hotel room. But nonetheless, as we begin this quarter, we are picking up practically where we left off in First Samuel and taking a look here in the content context of First Samuel chapter 8. So, of course, I'm going to just back up for a second. If you haven't had a chance to actually see the material for this particular quarter, you'll notice as you go from right to left across the top first, the first five lessons all have the theme of foolishness as part of it. Now, the one thing I hope that I convey every time I do this with you and I retitle the lesson is that it's not that the lesson title the Gospel Project writers chose was an inappropriate by no means, but what I'm trying to do is perhaps think a little bit more outside of the box that they're placing the lesson in. And it's not inappropriate that they're attempting to do that by no means, but there's more to glean from the lesson perhaps than the thing that they want us to focus on. And again, I'm trying to get us to think more in line with the larger picture, the biblical meta narrative per se, than just the particular, maybe in this case, moral application, because no doubt there is some foolishness going on here. But again, I don't think it's perhaps the best choice to elevate that to the position of primacy. Again, if we're only focusing on the moral aspect of any of these lessons in the Old Testament, it seems to give the picture, or at least the palpated perception, that the Old Testament is more or less akin to Aesop's fables, that there are moral lessons to be learned from every single thing that we're reading. And again, it's not to say that there aren't, but that's not the primary lesson that we're supposed to be learning from it, because that's not the reason the stories were written. And of course, it comes a little bit disjointed with trying to read in the New Testament and then trying to make everything in the New Testament also something that has a primary moral application to it rather than understanding what the narrative is. So let's take a dive with that in first before we attempt to try to get anywhere near a moral application point. So instead, I'm giving it a bit of a lengthier title here, that perverted justice happens to spawn political stupidity in Yahweh's kingdom. So with that in mind, let's work through this. So I hope the slide isn't confusing. It might be a little bit, but let me just first draw for you how this is supposed to be laid out. So I'm going through the top of the slide first, and we're going to be working from the box of Moses, almost in this horseshoe fashion, going in that direction. Okay. So let me erase these markers real quick. All right. So let's start with Moses. Again, in previous lessons, we've talked extensively about how all the judges seem to stand in light of Moses. They're being raised up as a new Moses for the people. It's not that Moses is that special of a person. It's just the fact that Moses was the one that God chose. And Moses served as he did. And God continues to use a figure like Moses to ignite a new exodus from the self-imposed exile that people continue to throw themselves into in the period of the judges. And we're not yet out of the period of the judges. In this passage, we're seeing its demise being orchestrated, because it would seem from the outset of this, it was perhaps meant to continue, or at least that's what Samuel seems to understand it, maybe even want on some level, because, well, the action it takes. But before we get there, let's first just reiterate a few things with respect to the fact that judging Israel is not something that is new under Othniel, the very first judge mentioned in the book of Judges. If we go back to those lessons, the reason why I continue to point back to Moses was because this was something that was a very critical function for Moses. When we use the word judge, it's meant to harken back to what Moses was doing. So I've used this passage before. It should be somewhat familiar. So in Exodus chapter 18, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, has come to visit the people out in the wilderness near Sinai. And then he witnesses what his son-in-law is doing. And he goes out early in the morning with a chair, sits down in front of the people, and remains there seemingly all day long until at the end of the day drags himself into the tent. Jethro asks the simple question, "What were you doing?" So Moses replied to his father, "Because the people come to inquire of God, so inquire of God, whenever they have a dispute, so clearly a disagreement, it comes to me and I make a decision between one man and another." But the purpose behind this is not to just simply arbitrate between the two of them, and one person is either proven right or one person is awarded punitive damages or any of these things. The ultimate goal behind it is that he would teach them God's statutes and law, that this is judging. So it's important for us to operate that with a proper mindset of what judging is. So judging above all else is not necessarily strapping on armor and taking up weapons and going to defeat enemies in battle, which often seems to be the prevalent thing in the book of Judges, because that's the thing that we're told with respect to those people as God raises up these figures. They're battling with Israel's oppressors, and then after these oppressors are defeated, they then go on to judge Israel for however many years, but nothing is ever really said with respect to what it means to judge. But when you look at someone like Deborah, who judges Israel, not to say that she wasn't a militant figure, you go back to that particular story and how she's addressing Barak. She gives Barak marching orders, but she also says that she is going to flush out Sisera and their enemies in battle as well. So it seems like she took up a posture as a field commander as well. Whether that's the case, not entirely sure, but that's exactly what the text seems to very strongly insinuate. But let me digress away from it. What was Deborah doing before she took up this posture as a co-commander on the field with Barak? She had been judging Israel for years. So her story is a bit unique in comparison to Othniel, who first leads in battle, then judges, and many of the others after, who actually have a story for us to unpack. Again, many judges are named and we're only told about the length of time that they judged and nothing else. But that being said, Deborah was already courted, honored as a prophetess amongst the people. So she had been spiritually leading them for some time. So she is probably one of the strongest examples of what judgeship was meant to connote as goes its function within those people who were leading Israel. Again, all attaching them back to Moses as his shadow is being cast long over them, so that we can see that what God was doing in the midst of all of this was raising up Moses-like figures to continue this process of ending their exile, in this case, the exile they imposed upon themselves, by bringing about a new Exodus. So judging is teaching. We get to Deuteronomy chapter 1. Notice what Moses has to say as he's imparting commands with respect to how others are to continue judging Israel. So it wasn't that Moses was the sole judge. In fact, it was at this point in Exodus chapter 18 where his father gives him very wise counsel and says, what you're doing really is not the most effective way of doing this. It's not wise. He tells him you should orchestrate the people into essentially a system of lower courts, if you will, where you'll appoint judges over smaller groups that are more at the clan level than tribe level. And then if after all of that, they can't solve the disputes, then those in harder cases should consider coming to you. And eventually this function winds up being passed over to the high priest and the priests that will, when I say rule, I don't mean in a monarchical way, but rule in the sense that they are going to be the ones whom God will speak through when it comes to arbitrating judgment. Remember, he gives Aaron and every high priest that will follow after him the Urim and Thummim, a way for discerning God's will in difficult moments when they need that. And of course, it does get used from time to time, perhaps most notably by the figure of David. But nonetheless, Moses even places the people under penalty of death if anyone comes to hear or bring their case up to that level. If they refuse to adhere to the judgment that's given, they are actually to be put to death because it's refusing the very words of the Lord. That's how serious it was to be taken, as goes the judgment that would be administered at that level. So after Moses appoints those judges, now several years later, we get Deuteronomy chapter 1, where Moses is kind of finishing out his tenure as Israel's prophet and priestly king also, but he says, I commanded your judges at that time, again, back in Exodus 18, hear the cases between your brothers, judge rightly between a man and his brother or his resident alien. So even they are to be shown proper justice. There is not to be any measure of partiality when deciding a case. It doesn't matter if it's between a foreigner and a native Israelite or two native Israelites, or maybe even two resident aliens. Justice is supposed to be the same no matter what. He commands them, you are not to be intimidated by anyone, because obviously that's a natural way of attempting to try to sway courts to judge in your favor is harass or malign their family or their personal health and safety. Ultimately, judgment belongs to God, and they are to remember that. They are judging in his stead, and they represent that, him when they do judge. So judging has to be impartial above all else, because it has a deep, it's the word I'm trying to find here. It has a foundation built upon righteousness. So right has to be done no matter what, even if it comes at the threat of punishment or intimidation or anything negative to the judge themselves because of the wicked people they're trying to arbitrate between. They have to be fearless, just like the prophets of Israel, in speaking the words of the Lord. So now we come over to 1 Samuel chapter 12, which I realize we're not there yet, but this is kind of the right-sided bookend to our story if we're starting on the left side of this and we're working chronologically through it. So we're going to get to 1 Samuel 8, as you see here in just a second, but as we're rounding this out and we're getting to the place where eventually Samuel is going to anoint the king over Israel, but before he does that, he wants to readdress to them why what they're doing perhaps is not wise, and he asks them out loud, I have led you from my youth until now. Here I am. So bring charges against me, or before me, or bring charges against me before the Lord and his anointed. Of course, his anointed would be Saul. So whose donkey have I taken? Who have I wronged or mistreated? Or who gave me a bribe to overlook something? And clearly, everyone says with unanimity, no one. You have not wronged anyone. You have led us faithfully up to this point. Now, of course, as we're looking at this, we're about to see here in 1 Samuel chapter 8, one of the reasons why, in fact, the chief reason why the people did not want the judges that Samuel had appointed. But before we get there, we can at least say that Samuel judged impartially. He understood very clearly and took extreme caution in exercising his office as prophet, certainly, because he's the one that gets to come into the divine court to hear the divine counsel speak amongst what the Lord has to say. In fact, that's one of the reasons. Said speak amongst what the Lord has to say. I think that doesn't make sense. Sorry, let me backtrack for a second. To speak aloud and to hear what the Lord has to say amongst his divine counsel. It's not often stated, but in the Old Testament, Samuel is referred to not only as prophet, but also as a seer. So they are not necessarily two different offices or two different functions per se. But what we do surmise is that part of what the seers were allowed to do was come into that divine counsel presence of the Lord. And of course, this function seems to be something that's at play and present with all prophets of Israel, not just seers versus prophets. But my point is that they get to see that apocalyptic concept of what's going on behind the scenes when Yahweh is taking counsel amongst those who he has appointed to share his authority with. And so anyway, he has been completely above reproach in all of this. But here's the problem. So back to 1 Samuel chapter 8, he's grown old and he's appointed his sons as judges over Israel. Now, certainly, this little part right here, no doubt, begins to create lots of questions, or at least it should create lots of questions. First of all, how do Samuel's sons come to be like the wicked sons of Eli? Now, we're not told that they're quite as wicked as they are, because they're not sleeping with the maidens in the tabernacle and they're not stealing from God. But as they were judges over Israel, hence the reason why I've taken measures to reiterate some of the things we've already talked about and build on that. The fact that judges are supposed to teach, they're supposed to be impartial. Samuel has given a very good example for them to follow, but for whatever reason, they didn't stick with him. So they were judges in Beersheba. However, his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned toward dishonest profit that took bribes, and they perverted justice. So clearly, it's enough to make people cry out because of their tyrannical oppressiveness, the same way that people cried out against Eli's wicked sons. And they chastised them for doing the very thing that they were not supposed to be doing as priests, and then it's just taking whatever they wanted. It wasn't that they were just simply taking it, they were being extremely bullish about it. They were even threatening people who were attempting to try to say something like this. You go back and read the account. So what's very clear here is that Samuel's sons are perverted. There's no doubt about that fact. Perverted with respect to justice. They cannot be trusted. They are not acting righteously, and they have no business leading Israel. Again, they have not followed in their father's footsteps, and because of this, this is what it's led to, this kind of debauchery. So the people instead decide to do something different. Now, of course, this creates more questions. Well, what could have been done? It seems like this is a non-remedial situation, or remediable situation, perhaps is the right term. Because how would you correct this? These men are just that. Samuel's sons are men. It's not to say that they can't change. I mean, they can definitely have a moment of repentance in which they've essentially become something of a new creature. That God, with His Spirit, changes their hearts in such a way that now that they're properly outfitted for the office, they can do this much better with the desire to satisfy Yahweh. It seems that that hasn't happened, which, of course, creates even more questions. As I said before, how could Samuel's sons become like the sons of Eli? What did Samuel do wrong if he did do something wrong? Of course, it's easy for us to want to assign fault to him because otherwise his sons, if they had paid attention to their father, would not have turned out this way. That's not true. It's not true. Of course, we have many examples, even we ourselves in the lives of our own children can find ourselves scratching our heads wondering what went wrong. But to offer up some possible explanation here, if we're going to perhaps dissect in this forensic way what may have happened here, I think what we can perhaps surmise is that Samuel was a busy man. Samuel was constantly doing this itinerant thing with respect to making the circuit throughout Israel and offering up offerings in the different high places. And who knows, maybe he didn't take his sons with him, or he did take his sons with him, but even though he took his sons with him, ministerial needs of his position were always pressing, and he didn't have a chance to really be the good father that he always intended to be. And of course, we as parents understand that guilt far too well with respect to watching our children grow up and looking back with some measure of regret, perhaps, at how we didn't quite do the things that we wanted to do. And of course, with that, it may have in some way caused some consequences that we didn't intend for them to. But I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole, but because it doesn't really help the trajectory of the lesson here. Let's go now to the bottom of the screen. And we're going to see how this becomes something of a thorn for Israel. So how this winds up leading to political stupidity in Yahweh's kingdom, going back to the example here under Moses. So in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 1, here we have Moses kind of recounting Israel's history from the moment that they leave Sinai and they're on their way to Canaan. Through the retelling of their history over the last 40 years, Moses is also giving the law for a second time to the people and using these moments in their history to highlight for them why these laws are important and to double down on the law to make sure they understand the wisdom within it. So as he's going back to readdress what happened in Numbers chapter 13 and 14, it takes on a little bit of a different angle here because this is what Moses says. Then all of you approached me and said, let's send men ahead of us so that they may explore the land for us and bring us back a report about the route we should go up and the cities we will come to. But if you go back to Numbers chapter 13, listen to what is said here in Numbers chapter 13, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, send men to scout out the land of Canaan I'm going to give to the Israelites. Of course, people have tried to pick this apart and say this is a complete contradiction, which is it? Well, the people apparently brought a plan to Moses, and Moses shared it with the Lord, and then the Lord agreed with that. Yes, let's do that. It's not to say it was a bad thing for them to want to do that. After all, bringing the report back along with the evidence that Moses then tells them they are to retrieve, bring back uh, evidence that the produce of the land is bountiful and abundant. So this will hopefully stir up the desire within the people to want to go and take the land. But the men wind up going in the completely opposite direction here. And these are trustworthy men. They're, after all, the leaders of their tribes. And yet this is what happens. I digress. So the people were the ones who concocted the plan, and it wasn't a bad plan. It could have been used for good. But I want to point out that what's going on here is that what they think is wise ultimately winds up becoming something of a thorn in their side because they're willing to listen to the counsel of these men, and even to the extreme that they are willing to completely forego not only the things that Yahweh promised and has proven himself faithful to deliver on so far and has done so supernaturally time and again. And they are willing to reject Yahweh's plan and move in the direction that these men suggest, right? So it completely severs the relationship between them and Yahweh, so much so that Yahweh consigns them to wandering in the wilderness and death over the next 40 years. Okay. So that leads us to Numbers chapter 14 to unpack that just a bit more. Why is the Lord bringing us into the land to die by the sword? Our wives and children will become plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? They said. So let's appoint a leader and go back to Egypt. They refuse the wisdom that Joshua and Caleb offer, and of course the wisdom that Yahweh has been laying down from the moment that Moses showed up in Israel, that he's going to be bringing them into the land with milk and honey. That happens before the very first of the plagues play out, and over 10 plagues, they see how Yahweh decimated Egypt, and Egypt actually holds sway over Canaan at several points in their history, and that perhaps even some of these kingdoms at that point were maybe even in some way, it depends on which time period we're talking about as to when the Exodus may have occurred, actually been under the thumbnail of the Egyptians, and maybe even postured as vassal states and paying tribute to Egypt because of previous militant campaigns that came through and dominated Canaan and forced those people into this position of subservience. Oh, but that being said, that's not that matters so much. But they watched what Yahweh did to the mightiest kingdom on earth, and yet they don't trust that he can preserve them in battle. We know that story too well. So we come over here to 1 Samuel chapter 8, and what we're seeing here is a repeat of this, what the people think are wise. This is what leads them to this politically stupid maneuver here in wanting a king. So after the people demand that Samuel give them a king like all the other nations, he tells them what they're doing is wrong, that he refuses to do it, and then he comes before the Lord, and the Lord says, they're doing the same thing to you that they have done to me since the day I brought them out of Egypt, which is exactly what we just rehashed over here. This is not the first occurrence of that. Of course, the first occurrence is the very moment when they're on the eastern side of the Red Sea, and then they begin to grumble because they don't have water, because they should know that Yahweh will deliver. He will protect them. He's not going to allow them to simply thirst to death in the wilderness. And they've continued to chide him and test him over and over again until they outright reject him, as they did in Numbers chapter 14. Until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. So warn them and tell them about the customary rights of the king who will reign. So again, like it was in Deuteronomy 1, the people think they know what they want. They think that what is wise is the best position to take. And again, it's not to say it's the outright wrong maneuver to make. It's just the timing of it. And of course, it's the rationale behind why they want a king. They want to be like the other nations. So again, we have to go back and reiterate what's going on in Genesis chapter 49. Jacob, or Israel, as he's referred to at that point in the story, being a much older man and about to die, winds up telling his sons in a prophetic sense what is to befall them in the later days. And he promises that kingship will come to the house of Judah, and that the scepter or right to rule will not depart from him until it comes to the person for whom it belongs. And of course, in later centuries, this is going to be understood as something of a messianic prophecy. That being said, though, it's a bit of an odd choice that the Lord brings the first king from the tiniest tribe in Israel, and that happens to be Benjamin, right? So point is that not only is there a promise of a king there, but then we go to Deuteronomy 17, and Moses tells the people that when you appoint a king over you, as the other nations have. Now, there might be some measure of debate there with respect to whether or not Moses is either being maybe sarcastic in this statement because he's kind of putting them in a place where he's speaking somewhat down toward them, saying, "You do what you've done and try to be like the other nations, appoint a king over you. This is the law for the king." But there are several others who would say that's not necessarily the case. That again, based on Genesis 49, Israel is meant to have a king at some point. And when the king is appointed over Israel, this is the law for the king. It's meant to be stricter on him than it is anyone else with respect to making sure he gets the point very clearly. He's not above his countrymen in a way that puts him in a more favorable position or light than any of the rest of the Israelites. And he must judge the people with impartiality and always with righteousness because he holds the highest position in the land. And so when a king is appointed, then he is to work alongside the Lord's prophet and with the priesthood to make sure that judgment is rendered rightly. So I want to make sure that we understand that what the people are asking for is not wrong. It's the motive for which they are asking. It's the timing in which they are asking because the Lord has not brought them to a place yet where the time has come for a king. Now, it certainly seems that the Lord is making those moves if we look at the far larger picture here with respect to what I've said in previous weeks, the fact that the Lord has now imposed exile upon himself when he allowed the Philistines to capture the ark. Then the ark comes back into the land, but the ark never returns to the Mosaic tabernacle. The tabernacle was destroyed, apparently rebuilt at some point, and it's used again as a high place to offer sacrifices by the time of Solomon. But David commissions the building of the temple, and the Lord blesses off on that through the prophet Nathan, who tells him that David's son will build this temple. And so when that time comes, the tabernacle's packed up and it's never seen again, at least out in the open with respect to any of the stories of Scripture after Solomon. So that being said, it seems like the Lord is definitely moving things in that direction as far as this new Exodus picture that he's given here. He's not going to go back to the status quo as it was in former Judges. And he seems to be setting things up in the stories of Hannah at the beginning of the book of First Samuel, and of course even Ruth between the Judges and Samuel, with the hint at David's genealogy at the end that he's moving toward this position of a messianic figure like David to bring unification to this federation of tribes and forge them into a kingdom and bring about the blessing of Abraham through his sons after him. He sets him up as a house and a dynasty. But again, we're not there yet. So because of the reason why these people are asking as they are, the Lord wants to make sure that they understand the wisdom that's coming from the mouth of Samuel here with respect to how the king is going to act amongst them. He tells them very clearly all the things the king will do, what he'll take. He'll take from their best sons, he'll take from their best daughters, he'll make them soldiers, he'll make them artisans, he'll make them servants within the palace, he'll take from their best fields, he'll require a tithe, and they're already giving tithes every year, essentially, to the Levitical tribe, their clans, and the tabernacle for their sustenance. Now more will be taxed from them. And of course, with all the idea that them being set up in the land, they're supposed to receive the abundance of the land, and now someone is taking from them, it almost postures Saul like a Pharaoh. The Pharaoh, especially, not of Joseph's story, but more of Moses' story, who subjugates the Israelites and takes from them their dignity and essentially everything that they had with respect to all the wealth that they owned. At least making it his in the sense that he could do with it as he will, even take their very lives as he wishes, because again, they're slaves. So after saying all this, it seems to suggest that Saul is going to be a rather wicked king. Before we get into the story of Saul, I just want to drop this down there that he's not postured as a wicked king up front, but we're not going to go into that quite yet. Rather, I just want to round out with this last point. The people refused to listen to Samuel. They said, "No, We must have a king over us. Then we'll be like all the other nations. Our king will judge us. And more important, he'll go out before us and he'll fight our battles. Now we don't have to muster ourselves together into uh, a armed force and then go and fight the battles. And then, men potentially lose their lives. We'll have a professional fighting force, permanently standing armed soldiers who are going to come, and this will be their job. And then we can attend to things that matter to us with respect to raising crops, raising families, and all that kind of stuff. So after Samuel had poured out to them a chance to abate their decision by telling them about the rules of the entitlements of the king. At that point, they could have recanted and said, you know what? It ain't worth it at this point. We'll just wait. If the Lord intends for us to have a king, then we'll let him appoint a king over us. Instead, they press forward and say, no, we must have a king. So they refuse the wisdom, as they did over here in Numbers chapter 14 with respect to the words of Caleb and Joshua. So it leads to political stupidity, because if we're familiar with how the story plays out, we understand what winds up coming on the other end of this. As goes what will happen with the kingship of Saul, and how over the 40 years that he reigned, he became far more oppressive, and much like a Pharaoh, even though he wasn't postured to be that at the outset, which is the subject for next week's lesson. So anyway, well, I appreciate your time. Thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful. I would just, simply say in summary, if you choose to use some of this material, I hope that you use all of it, but if you choose to use this material, I know it might be a bit difficult, perhaps at the level that you're looking at it. If this is new to you, say, okay, well, how am I going to piece this all together? Well, it's part of the reason why it's arranged as it is on the slide for you. But on top of that, I would say one big important point to emphasize here is just the simple fact that Samuel served as a judge. His sons were now postured to serve as judges. And judging Israel means that they are supposed to be teaching Israel how to be obedient to God's law. And they are to do this with impartiality, because, of course, in teaching God's law through this, they're having to render judgment as a means of arbitrating between different parties, one who has offended another. And so with that, there, of course, is going to be a party who may not very well appreciate the answer that's given. And they may even attempt to try to not abide by that. And with that, there's going to be some stiffening of hearts and some measure of rebellion going on. There may even be rebellion at play, hence the reason why the offense happened in the first place. But it's to try to help to get everyone reconciled one to another, and ultimately reconciled unto God, because someone probably has sinned in this process. And then, of course, with that measure of impunity being brought to the person who has created the offense, and ultimately the dissension between themselves and their neighbors, and let's put them at odds with the Lord as well, then if reconciliation happens, everyone wins in this. And of course, this may come with a fair measure of power here, but it's not meant to be exploited. I'm teaching again in my summary. Sorry. Let me wind this down back to the fact that teaching is going to be put on display through judging and arbitrating. That's what Samuel has been doing. But because the fact his sons are unsavory characters, the people instead are done with the judge's cycle themselves, and they want a king for the wrong reasons. And the Lord is warning them, a king will do these very things that will become more taxing to you than you realize. And while he has poured out wisdom through Samuel, who they recognize has been a righteous and impartial judge, they don't want to listen. They don't want to listen to their Moses of their time. Instead, they press forward with what they think is wise, and of course, it's going to wind up costing them. So, I hope that was helpful. I do appreciate you listening.